You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. Let's talk about the news stories that are fascinating us right now and how they affect the Pacific Northwest. And today for Front Page, we are headed down to PDX and our friend Melanie Henshaw of InvestigateWest. She's the Indigenous Affairs reporter there and a citizen of the Mvskoke Creek Nation. Melanie, thank you so much for joining me today for Front Page.
Libby, it's great to be back. Thank you so much for having me on Soundside.
Okay, I'm going to put you on the spot here and ask, what is your favorite nickname for the city of Portland? Because you're a Portlander. Is it Stumptown, City of Roses? What do you like to call it? PDX?
I'm a big fan of Stumptown. Stumptown is great. I just recently got one of my parents a Stumptown hoodie, which they sport proudly.
Amazing. So we're going to go to Stumptown for this next story. And let's go to the first story on Front Page.
The city's emergency overnight shelter program has surpassed 100,000 nights of safe sleep for our houseless neighbors. Emergency overnight shelters save lives.
We're going to start off by talking about Mayor Wilson, the political outsider who promised a change from business as usual at City Hall and vowed to tackle the homelessness crisis. Except Seattleites, here is the twist. I'm not talking about Seattle's Katie Wilson. I'm talking about Keith Wilson, who was elected mayor of Portland in 2024. That was his voice that you just heard. The mayors Wilson share a surname and some campaign promises, but there is some daylight between them. He's really seen as a moderate Democrat by Portland standards. He's a business owner. Well, of course, Katie Wilson, she's a self-described democratic socialist and a transit advocate. Melanie, though, their victories, I feel like they both really showed that voters in the cities of Seattle and Portland were sick of the status quo. They really wanted progress on homelessness, and they, so far, after their ambitious promises, have had mixed results when it comes to making progress on the issue of homelessness. So tell me a bit about how the other Mayor Wilson, as I'll call him, Keith Wilson in Portland, has been doing. He promised to end unsheltered homelessness in Portland by 2026. How are things going?
Right. He was really elected by a broad coalition of folks on that promise of ending unsheltered homelessness. He promised to set up 1,500 beds in his first year to go towards that goal of ending unsheltered homelessness, which he managed to achieve.
Wow, that's huge. That's a really big number.
Right. However, the beds are only overnight. So there's not any similar uptick in wraparound daytime services. And so jury is really still out on whether or not homelessness is down. Mayor Keith Wilson says, yes, that's what we're seeing on the streets. But county data says no, that it's actually gone up by around 3,000 people since Mayor Wilson has taken office.
Wow. And he has disputed that county data. That's why he's saying basically anecdotally that people are seeing a difference, right?
Right. He's saying anecdotally what we're seeing on the streets, and with the fact that we have all of these shelter beds, we're seeing homelessness go down. But it's also a question of, are folks really no longer suffering from unsheltered homelessness if they only have a place to be between the hours of 8 p.m. and 6 a.m.?
Yeah. And also, what are the next steps, right? If you don't have a case manager looking for, ways to potentially get you into some kind of a permanent situation. Just to contrast that with the way Katie Wilson has approached things, she promised 4,000 units of shelter by the end of her first 4 years in office. The big deadline that's coming up that her staff has already said, basically, we don't think, it doesn't look like we're going to meet this, is the 500 units of shelter by the World Cup in June. Now, they're kind of focused, according to the Seattle Times, on the end-of-year goal, the 1,000 units of shelter. And last week, they announced 75 new pallet shelters going in Inner Bay. And in a big difference from what we see in Portland, they will have the wraparound services. However, they'll also be twice as expensive as shelter beds without wraparound services. So the news this week out of City Hall is that the city council did pass some funding for new shelter and also the authority for the city to lease big pieces of land, which they didn't have before. So again, the needle is moving, and it's going to be moving faster than it ever has before in Seattle, according to people who know how, these leases work and the speed at which the city can spin these up. But big promises from Katie Wilson, and already the deadline is starting to get nudged on some of these things. Any final thoughts on this, Melanie, about what's happening in Portland and Seattle?
It's an interesting contrast, the duo of Kay Wilsons, who are leading both of these cities on a promise of substantially reducing the impacts of homelessness on these metro areas. Portland City Council just discovered another pot of millions of unspent housing dollars. And it really raises the question of how can Portland adequately address the homelessness crisis if it doesn't even know how much money it has in the bank to address it?
Both cities facing a big budget shortfall overall, though, but it doesn't hurt to find a little extra money. It does leave you a little bit scratching your head, though, how that could happen. Moving on to the next story on Front Page.
I think there's a number of things that President Trump has taken actions to undo the harm done during the Biden presidency.
So sticking with politics, Melanie, I want to do a quick check-in on the hottest congressional race in the Pacific Northwest, really the only truly competitive one, and that is the Washington 3rd District congressional race in the southwest part of the state. This voice that you just heard was Minority Leader John Braun, who got the nod from President Trump. He's officially endorsed Braun as the candidate that Republicans should rally behind in the 3rd District. He posted on Truth Social essentially saying that Braun was going to be good for secure borders, clean air, clean water, and that incumbent Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez, the Democrat there, wanted open borders and transgender for everything. This was actually a template that he used for some other endorsements as well, some of these issues. You used to live in this district, Melanie, in the 3rd Congressional District in Southwest Washington, and it has a really interesting history. We probably don't have time to go, blow by blow through all of it, but this was a big surprise when Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez won in 2022 because it is a pro-Trump district on paper, but she's managed to hold on to the seat. What do you think about this endorsement by Trump for John Braun, and what's the head for this race?
It's an interesting development, although probably pretty expected by most folks at this point. Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez has upset a lot of her Democratic base. I've seen some figures citing her to be the most Trump-aligned Democrat in Congress. Now, when she initially won the district, I believe it was seen as in favor of Republicans by around 3 points. So it wasn't even necessarily considered a swing when she initially won it. And I believe both times that she has won Washington's 3rd District, the final margin has been fewer than 5,000 votes. And she relied very heavily on Democratic voters from Vancouver. But in her time in office, voters in Vancouver have seemed to feel that she's spent more time appealing to red voters in the outer part of the district, because Washington's 3rd District is quite large. Vancouver, Washington is the population center, but it includes several conservative counties. And Braun was traditionally seen as taking a more moderate tack up until recently, sometimes even upset national GOP figures. But we'll see if this endorsement really shifts the needle. When Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez has won in the past, there were a lot of split ballots in her favor. Folks who voted for her, but otherwise voted for Republicans in other statewide races. So we'll see if her appeals to the right are able to maintain that margin of more conservative and moderate voters that helped push her over the line.
She does have a Democratic challenger, although the last fundraising totals, according to the Washington State Standard, for the Democratic challenger to Gluesenkamp-Perez left less than $10,000. So we'll see how that develops. Super interesting race. Like you say, it's sort of Gluesenkamp-Perez trying to thread a needle on maintaining the Democratic base in a pro-Trump district and doing enough to reach across the aisle to grab those split-ticket voters. And will it continue to work for her? Her margins have been slim, but they have increased between 2022 and 2024. So moving on to our third story on Front Page. And this one, Melanie, I'm going to turn over to you because it's a big investigation from your colleague, Kelsey Turner at Investigate West. And the headline is Washington courts rarely discipline guardians ad litem who are accused of misconduct in custody cases. So first of all, I think, what are guardians ad litem? And then what did your colleague find here, Melanie?
Right. So Kelsey's investigation is something that she's been following for quite some time. Guardians ad litem are supposed to be neutral court investigators that are appointed in custody cases, particularly in cases where there might be domestic violence or substance abuse. And they are supposed to investigate what is going on in the home and sometimes asked to make parenting recommendations or custody recommendations based on their findings. Now, these guardians ad litem have relatively little oversight, and the amount of training that they receive has been criticized by some. There's not a whole lot of opportunities for new training for guardians ad litem. And really what Kelsey's investigation found was that some parents found that the reports that these guardians ad litem are filing in court are inaccurate, and that the process for filing any sort of grievance or challenging them would cost them to expend lots of money to sue to get the guardian off the case, while still maintaining fear that this might impact custody cases. And Kelsey looked at complaints that had been found to be having merit and found incidences where guardians ad litem allegedly even threatened parents and told them they would take them to the wall if the findings that the guardian had filed in court were challenged. They also found instances where children were placed in the custody of alleged abusers after the guardian ad litem made an inaccurate finding in a case, and that the parents found the process for filing a grievance to be cumbersome or confusing. And there are just a lot of concerns around the accuracy of these reports and the ability and process for parents to challenge them.
And I encourage everybody to read Kelsey's story in Investigate West. Again, it's about guardians ad litem who have a ton of power in these custody cases. You mentioned the situation of a child being placed with an alleged abuser. That was the story of Stephanie, a mom who shared her situation in the lead of Kelsey's story. And what will really stick with me is how the 3 cases of alleged domestic abuse were presented by Stephanie's ex as violations by Stephanie, when in fact they were allegations against him. But they were allowed to be unchallenged in his presentation to the guardian ad litem, and that led to her kid being taken away and placed with him. And eventually he did plead guilty to domestic violence. Very complicated issue, but so vital for parents who are going through this. Just quickly, Melanie, before we turn the page, what is next in this case? There are legislators who are looking at reforms, right, in Washington?
Right. Reforms are being looked at, things like standardizing qualifications rather than having things be on a county-by-county basis, increasing the amount of training, particularly for folks who were certified as guardians ad litem prior to 2018 when they didn't receive more expanded training on cultural issues and domestic violence, and also just the potential for narrowing their role to where it's just an investigative role and rather than investigative and making custody recommendations.
Okay, we are turning to the final story on Front Page.
Now you're lost in the heat of it all.
This is a story about being lost. It's about a tow truck driver in Belfair who hiked into the woods to save a stranded Uber Eats delivery driver who got stuck after he followed his Waze app onto a logging road. Who hasn't been there before, following your map app somewhere you shouldn't be? This happened late Sunday night, close to 10 p.m. Sam Cadle of North Shore Towing gets the call for help. The delivery driver apparently drove over a mile down a dirt road. It was on private property. Sam can't access him. He ends up walking to get the driver to walk him out of the woods over a half mile. And then the next day getting permission to go on the land to actually retrieve the Toyota sedan, who looks like it got stuck in the mud or bottomed out or something. So again, Sam Cadle, North Shore Towing, is the hero of this story. He spoke with King 5 about all of this. And I guess my question for you, Melanie, is have you ever followed a map app astray and gotten stuck or gotten lost? It's, you got to use your own judgment, right? You can't just be following these maps blindly.
Absolutely. I mean, what a heroic effort by this tow truck driver to rescue this man.
Amazing work, yeah.
But for me, I think back to one time when I was driving between Los Angeles and Las Vegas in a very, very, very stubborn traffic jam where folks were driving on the shoulder, to give you an idea of how bad things were. And maps very cleverly suggested I just take this exit and it would save me a huge amount of time. Ended up stuck in the desert with my other fellow travelers, watching people's wheels spin out in the sand. And some folks who had more low-riding cars, I remember watching a Corvette get their bumper ripped off. Beautiful Joshua trees, though.
Yeah, beautiful Joshua trees. As long as you have water and sustenance for however long it takes to get a tow truck out to the desert. Melanie Henshaw, I'm sure glad you got out of that situation and that you could join me for Front Page today. Thank you so much for being here.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Libby.
She's the Indigenous Affairs reporter for Investigate West and also a citizen of the Mvskoke Creek Nation. Thanks again, Melanie.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. Don't forget you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org or on your favorite podcast app.